Hi, everybody. I am Dot Miller. I am your Mayor Pro Tem for the city of Arvada. And with me today is our incredible police chief, Link Strate. We are here today to share recent conversations occurring in our local city government. These conversations touch on the national narrative around policing and how your city leaders are examining how we provide services and support to our amazing community. I have a personal connection with the current events, and like many of you, had a lot of questions. After speaking with Chief Strate, I felt strongly that we needed to share the message from his department. I know I felt more comfortable having some of my own concerns addressed, and the chief and I agreed to share more of the information because I know I have received some of the same questions from you guys out in the community. So Chief, thank you so much for sitting down with me today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. So let's jump right in. What are your impressions of the current focus on police practices and social justice?
Well, it's hard to have this conversation today without first speaking of what occurred in Minneapolis. And so just let me say this as we start this conversation. What I saw happen in Minneapolis is not reflective of anything that I've been taught, any of my training, any of my experiences in my 33 years in law enforcement here in Arvada. That was an unfortunate event. And looking at that, I think one of the things that struck most of us in law enforcement is there seemed to be just an absence of common decency and humanity from one person to another. So having said that, as we look at policing today, I'd really like to focus on the Arvada Police Department. I can't speak to the tactics and training of other agencies, but I can speak to the tactics and training and the personnel and the culture of the Arvada Police Department.
When you mention culture, can you explain to us why it is so important and expand on the ways that the city maintains that culture?
So I'm glad you said the city maintains that culture, Dot. I think that's very important because it's broader than the police department. It's certainly our community. We're very fortunate to be policing the community that we do, the community of Arvada, an exceptional community that people really want to be here. The city leadership, city council, and then certainly city management and all the other departments, that creates that culture. But within the police department, I think some of the things that I could speak to that would really point out culture, first is our hiring standards. The Arvada Police Department today requires a 4-year degree. In law enforcement across the country in 2020, that is unusual still. I think it's important to note that Arvada has had that standard for 3 decades. For 30 years, we've had the standard that if you're going to be an Arvada police officer, you must have a 4-year degree. There's many reasons for that. For us, we just find that it gives our officers a broader experience on life, a broader view. There are studies that would indicate that officers who have college degrees are less likely to use force. And when they use force, that force is less. So that's one of the first things that speaks to our culture. Another thing is our accreditation through a CALIA. That is something that the Arvada Police Department did again decades ago. In 1986, we were the first agency in the state of Colorado to be accredited through CALIA and one of the first in the nation. And what that does for our culture, Dot, is that it makes us review our standards and our practices on a regular basis to make sure that what we are training, our policy, and how we go about conducting policing in this community is best practices. It's up to date. And here's what's important about that too, is it makes us continually change and improve and look at what we're doing. So that's part of our culture. It's perfectly expected here and accepted that we are going to continue to grow and that we are going to continue to learn. And in that, when we see major events, we always take a step back, we review what we're doing, and we say, what can we do better? So those are a couple of things that really kind of anchor our culture. The people in this police department really are what make that culture. And when we go out to look for an Arvada police officer, we look for high quality people that we believe will make exceptional police officers for this community.
In 2014, the Arvada Police Department went to sector-based policing. I think most people know about the community stations, but what does that mean for people who live in those areas and in the city as a whole?
And you kind of started that, Dot, with saying community stations, and that was purposeful for naming those. They weren't substations, they weren't sector stations, they're community stations. So we have 4 sectors in the city. We have the Northeast. Headquarters here is in the Southeast, and then we have a sector in the Northwest, which is our newest sector, and then we have a sector in the Southwest. Each of those sectors has a community station in it. We run police operations out of there. There's assigned a commander to oversee that sector. There's assigned supervisors, police officers, traffic, detectives are assigned out there. And the reason we did that is we understood that if we were going to provide the highest level of policing services, we really needed to understand those specific areas. If we look at the city as a totality, we get a different view of crime and trends and police needs. When we break it down to the sector level, we understand that what Delta sector out in the Northwest needs from their police is very different than what Baker sector here at headquarters in the Southeast part of the city. So we're able to tailor our police services. The commander in those sectors is expected to make contact with all the community groups, community leaders, schools, and understand what businesses are in their sector and what their specific needs are. Crime trends, traffic trends and patterns, and then quality of life issues. Really, what does the community want from their police department? So the sector-based strategy with our community stations, which the communities have just embraced, they see those as theirs, and they are. They all have at the center of that police station, that community station, is a community room that the community is open to use, and certainly COVID hasn't helped that. But outside of COVID, those stations or those community rooms are booked on a regular basis. So gives us that opportunity to connect at a different level with the community and not just that police community connection. It's just us as people.
You and I have had great conversations, Chief, and you know that I have a lot of diversity in my family. And I want to talk now about, what's going on in the world today. And, I didn't even know racism existed my whole life until my sister married my brother-in-law. He's Black. And I saw racism, and it was ugly, and it was cruel. And I think a lot of people that grew up like I did, where nobody talked poorly about anybody else and everybody was accepting of everybody, we didn't know racism was a thing. We had no idea. And now the community is talking about it loud. The nation is talking about it. It's actually really around the globe. And what we're seeing is that it's not, people don't understand that it's throughout the community, and they're just focusing on the police department because you guys are the enforcers of laws, right? So it sounds like the Arvada Police Department was doing a lot of things to be progressive in limiting racially biased policing. Let's talk about the new state law, police accountability and all the requirements, including body cameras. One of the first conversations that you and I had when you first became the chief, I called you and said, could we meet? I want to talk to you about body cameras and why our Arvada Police Department isn't wearing them. So can you talk about that a little bit, Chief?
Sure. And as I start this conversation, I want to mention that in today's environment, it's easy for communities and cities and city leaders to kind of look away when somebody wants to have a conversation about police. There seems to be a little shame across the country about policing, about the community's police departments. I would say that Arvada and city leadership in Arvada, and certainly me as a chief of police, this is an opportunity for us to be proud of our organization and show how different we are and what a great department we have and the quality of the people that we have here and how they conduct policing here. So I'm not going to shy away from that question. I'm not going to be embarrassed by the profession that I'm in or about the people that I work with, because they do this at an exceptionally high level. One of the things that we do, and we'll talk about the body-worn camera part of this, but one of the things that we do is that we make sure that we hire people. We talked about that educational requirement. I think that plays a great role in putting police officers out on the street that are tolerant and they're willing to learn and they're willing to understand and they're willing to work with things that are different than what they grew up with. So that's key to us. It's easy to go out there and hire. It's much easier to hire if you don't have that 4-year degree requirement, but it works for us. We train a great deal on anti-bias policing, microaggression. We want to make sure that our officers know what are triggers and things that, like you said, that didn't even recognize that racism existed as you were growing up. We want to make sure that our officers understand when they go out there what they're doing, who they're dealing with, and how to provide that highest level of service. Specifically to your question, Dot, about body-worn cameras. I think the first thing I'd like to mention about that is it's not by default that Arvada does not have body-worn cameras. We did an extensive research project and study to determine whether or not body-worn cameras were right for us and for our community. We determined that they weren't for a number of reasons. First, let me say this. If there is a fractured relationship between a community and a police department, you need to work on the underlying issues there. You need to try to fix those. Body-worn camera is not going to fix that fractured relationship. As far as our officers wearing them, I don't think they'll have any concern about wearing body-worn cameras. It may alleviate some of the minor complaints that are lodged against them. But if you look at it in a couple of ways, let's look at it first as a financial obligation. The Arvada Police Department has not paid one penny. I'd look for 5 years. I'm assuming it's 10 years, not one penny in civil rights violations over the course of those 5 years. We don't have a history of officers abusing their authority, and so those body-worn cameras aren't there to protect us. We estimate that the initial cost to start a body-worn camera program in the city of Arvada will be $1.4 million. It will then cost us $1 million a year, and as a council member, you recognize that that money has to come from somewhere. That's either training I can't provide my officers, equipment that I can't provide my officers, or I just can't hire officers because we have to find those dollars somewhere. So financially, it doesn't make a lot of sense for the city of Arvada. And then I think what concerns me most, though, is the notion that you can look at a snippet of video and you can make a determination of what occurred between a violent encounter between a police officer and a citizen. I would caution the public and make sure that we have that. That's a part of the investigation, but there still needs to be a complete and thorough investigation that is conducted. It is very difficult to capture in video the reality of a police encounter with somebody who is resisting arrest or who is resisting violently. So let's just take a step back. Let's not prejudge it because we have just a snippet of that, and make sure that we have a totality of the investigation as much as we can. And then if the officer was wrong, certainly that officer should be held accountable. But let's make sure we have a complete understanding of it as best as we can. So with all of that said, it does concern me a little bit that we're going to pay that money. I would note that we recognize that the state is going to be exempt from that. I would say they're probably going to be exempt from that. Their police officers are going to be exempt from that because of the cost. There's a significant cost to that. So as a business decision, it's questionable. As a investigative tool, it certainly can help, but it is not the end all to the investigation.
Chief, one of the terms people are talking about is defund the police. Can you share your thoughts on that dialogue?
Sure. And we got, and you know this as well as I do, Mayor Pro Tem, we got a lot of communication into the city, certainly into the police department. I know into city council and city leadership about demands to defund the police. There was a lot of call for that. What I would hope is that before people call for that, they first have a better understanding of American law enforcement. American law enforcement is unique. We are locally based. We here in Arvada have a different police department than Wheat Ridge, than Lakewood, than Denver. And so our community gets to dictate what they want out of their police department, how much money they want to spend for their police department, and what services they expect, and the level of those services. So before there's a demand, nationwide demand for defunding the police, let's understand what you're getting for your tax dollar from your own local police department. And in the city of Arvada, we have a very lean police department. We have 1.54 police officers per 1,000. For a city of over 120,000 people, that's one of the lowest you're going to see, certainly in the metro area, and it's low across the nation. So if you're going to defund the police, where does that impact the police department? What does that do to our ability to provide policing services? I think another thing that is behind that motivation or that statement, defund the police, is that people really want to make sure that we're spending dollars in the right areas. Is there some social nets that are there? Are we spending money on police rather than helping people that are struggling? I think people should understand in the city of Arvada, and I know you're aware of this, Mayor Pro Tem, we have co-responders that are assigned to the police department that work with those that are struggling with mental health. And their job is to respond to calls with police officers when appropriate, and then do a lot of background work assisting these individuals, making sure that they have access to the program and the resources that are available to them, so they are getting what they need, and then that service burden or that burden on personnel for the city is lessened. We also have a team that worked with chronically homeless individuals. Same philosophy, making sure that they get the resources that they need and that they have access to the programs and what is appropriately available to them. So before you call for defunding the police, I would ask the community to educate yourself and understand really what that means. But I will say this, the second wave of communication that I received in the chief's office after that were from those that are really at risk, some of our elderly population, and they were really concerned about this move to defund the police, and they just didn't want to have anything to do with that. They wanted to make sure that they had access to the police department, that there was going to be somebody that was going to be there, that was going to come out and provide them whatever service that they needed when they called. And then we got a third wave, which was what I believe is from the general public. It said, we appreciate our police department. We appreciate the service that we get, and we're not interested in defunding the police either. So I know there is that emotional response. I get that. We want to make sure that our police departments are doing the right thing. But I would ask the public, educate yourself on your local police department before you call for any defunding of it.
So let's have a conversation about SWAT teams. One thing that I have heard in the community is that, if the police funds a SWAT team, and they practice and they train, then they're going to want to look or find a way to use that SWAT team so that they're not just sitting around all the time. And Arvada doesn't seem like a place that would need a SWAT team. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Dot, that would be great if we didn't need a SWAT team and if we could live in a community where those things don't happen. And I would love that too. And that kind of goes hand in hand with the notion that there is a militarization of local law enforcement. And we're aware of that, and we certainly don't want to go out there and provide services in that style. We are not an occupying force in the city of Arvada. Most of us live here. My daughters were raised here, went to school here. So this is our community too. We're not a military force that comes in here and lays down the law. This is something that we're vested in. It is our community as well. Unfortunately, though, there are those events that are violent, and Arvada is not immune to that. We have had hostage situations where somebody has taken a child at gunpoint. We have photographs of our Bearcat, which is an armored vehicle that has rifle and handgun rounds that hit the glass right where the operator, in this case a police officer, Arvada police officer, was sitting. So we don't have the option when somebody is violent and armed to just say we're going to leave. That community is at risk, and the expectation is that we're going to come in there and contain it. Now, our tactics have changed greatly over the decades. We want to make sure that we can eliminate as much risk as we can. And we use a decision-making model here in Arvada. It's called PIE. And first thing is our priorities of life. First is the community, any community member. Second is the police officer, and third is the violent encounter, the violent subject. Okay, so we want to make sure that if we can, in any way, shape, or form, bring this to a conclusion without the loss of life, that is our priority. And then we look at the intelligence that is available to us. What information do we have? And then what environment are we operating in? Can we contain this individual? Can we make sure that we are evacuating the surrounding community or really understanding what that threat is? So while I would love to live in a community that there was no need for a SWAT team too, that's just not the reality. And we can't just say, because we want to turn our head to it, that it doesn't exist, that we don't need it. No, we actually do. Now, we partner with a regional SWAT team. So our officers are assigned to that. They're police officers full-time. They do the SWAT thing part-time. So they're still out there engaging in the community. They're still out there handling calls for service, and they still know who they're policing. That, again, it's just one of those necessities, unfortunately.
How are the more than 230 men and women in our police department doing through COVID and now the social justice events of the past 8 months?
Dot, I really appreciate the questions you're asking. You're kind of getting to the heart of some of the issues and concerns that law enforcement is faced with right now. I will tell you that it's been difficult. This has been one of the most difficult times in my policing career. I've been in policing for 33 years. It has been emotionally stressful. I look at these young men and women who have joined this honorable profession, and I am so grateful that we still have those individuals that raise their hand, that take that oath, and they go out there and protect this community. As it relates to COVID, I think what I would like to point out is that our officers know that by the nature of their business, they are putting themselves at a greater risk for exposure to COVID. That's one thing. Here's what the point I'd really like to make. They also know by what they do that they're putting their families at a greater risk for exposure to COVID. And yet they show up every day and they put on the uniform and they go out there and they provide the highest level of service that they can. Every moment of every day since this pandemic has broken out, we have had Arvada police officers on the street providing services, responding to calls, and responding to those that were in need. So for that, I'll be just internally grateful for what they do and how they do it.
Chief, is there any way people can contact the police department and speak with someone on the issues and get their questions answered?
Sure, we're very open to that. So there's a couple of ways that we can do that. We have our public information officer, Detective Dave Selling, and we also have our sector-based strategy, which we talked about. So I would encourage the first point of contact for anybody in the city that is looking for police services or any question is to contact their sector commander. In Adams sector, we have Commander Vanderveen, Bob Vanderveen. In Baker sector, we have Commander Betsy Westbrook. In Charlie sector, we have Commander Ron Avila. And in Delta sector, we'll have a new commander rotating up there, Commander Martin Nazarek. He's been a commander for years. But reach out to your sector commander and begin that conversation there would be my recommendation.
Chief, thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate it. And I feel very lucky to have such a progressive and responsive police department. You are representative of how our great team members holistically support residents, businesses, and visitors from Arvada. We need to have more of these kinds of conversations, and I know the city is planning that. So thank you so much. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate all of council's involvement in this community and their support of the police department.